thinking about wars, they tend to have a pretty obvious cause. The American Revolution, independence from Great Britain, right? The Civil War, slavery, World War II, Hitler trying to take over the world, Vietnam, the spread of communism. There's a clear goal to all of these wars, something they're trying to achieve, something they're trying to prevent. The same cannot be said, however, about World War I. World War I, or the Great War, had possibly a larger impact than any other war ever. It changed the world in irreversible ways. It changed mankind forever. It was so far beyond any conflict, any violence, any brutality that we had experienced before. The scale was like nothing before. The shock, the horror, the trauma. World War I issued in a new era of warfare, a new era of what was possible, new fears, new worst nightmares of humanity. But why? For what purpose? What were we trying to achieve or prevent? For what goal did we sacrifice the lives of some 30 million people? It's not so cut and dry with World War I. It can't be summed up in a handful of words like the other ones. The only thing we have, the only thing we cling to as some sort of short and sweet answer is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's what caused World War I, right? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I'm sorry, Franz Ferdinand who? Who was this guy? And why did his death spark the first ever World War? An event so horrific, so unprecedented, it would irrevocably change humankind. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. Today, we're talking about Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke, not the Scottish indie rock band. This topic was suggested by Arcelia on Instagram, and it is such a good one, so thank you for that. It's such a good one because I don't think many people know the first thing about Franz Ferdinand and the start of World War I. And it's actually, when you think about it, it's actually critically important. You know, I'm always saying that it's so important to learn history because it teaches us lessons. We learn from the mistakes of the past so that we hopefully don't repeat them in the future. Well, World War I was one of the most horrible things ever. We certainly do not want to repeat it, but how do we avoid that if almost no one knows how it started? So we know it has to do with this Archduke, this Franz Ferdinand guy. But that just doesn't really make sense, right? That has never made a whole lot of sense to me. Why would all of these countries, it ended up being like over 100 countries involved in this war in some way, why would these countries go to war or involve themselves even slightly in a war over this one random guy's death? So let's get this out of the way early. What you have to understand about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, everyone forgets about her, is that it was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, right? Another way to think about it, the world at that time was organized just so. It was layered and stacked into this perfect pyre. Nice dry kindling, wood laid just so, stacked so as not to suffocate the future flames, plenty of airflow, plenty of oxygen. For decades, this pyre had been laid, mostly due to European imperialism. We'll come back to that in a minute. But for decades, this pyre had been sort of artfully stacked, and no one even really realized that it was happening. And then, when shots rang out in Sarajevo on the morning of June 28th, 1914, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a man who meant very little to the vast majority of the countries that would involve themselves in World War I, these shots, that one death, That was the spark, okay? Now, if this spark had landed on a wet wood pile, if it had landed on the grass, in a bucket of water, moist soil, even a pyre that hadn't been so perfectly and artfully stacked, a pyre that laid flat, a pyre lacking oxygen or kindling, it would have fizzled right out. A tiny little trail of smoke wisping through the breeze. A spark extinguished. Done. But that is not where it landed. Because the world at that time, at the time of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, was in fact an artfully laid pyre just waiting for a spark. And when that spark drifted down and came to rest atop the pyre, it erupted into flames. And this bonfire that resulted, this was World War I. So before we get into Franz Ferdinand and the events surrounding his assassination, let's talk about why the world had transformed itself into a pyre waiting for a spark. For this, we can thank European imperialism, this unquenchable desire of European nations to take over the entire world. This, of course, started in the late 15th century, 1492 to be exact, when Spain sent Christopher Columbus west to find Asia, and he accidentally stumbled upon the Americas. The goal at that time was not imperialism. They weren't going to go take over Asia. They just wanted an easier way to trade for spices and whatnot. But then, when they finally realized that it was not Asia, and when they mistakenly began to believe that they were superior to the people, the quote, savages already living in this, quote, new world, they started to think that they were somehow entitled to it, the Europeans did. That it was, theirs for the taking, just waiting for them to come and take what they wanted. They could take chunks of the Americas, they could colonize them, make them part of Spain or England or France or whatever. That is how it started. But that's not even the heyday of imperialism. The heyday of imperialism, the peak, the age of imperialism, happened between 1870 and 1914. Not at all a coincidence that the end of that age, 1914, coincides with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the start of World War I. So, during this age of imperialism, the biggest players, Spain has sort of faded away a bit. They're not really like this big world power that they once were, in the 14, 15, 1600s when they were sort of on top. Great Britain and France are there now. They are running the imperialism show here during its peak. Germany, Belgium, Russia, the United States, Japan, Italy, and Portugal are also part of this. Spain is like, peace out, y'all. We did this centuries ago. Where were y'all? So the Americas have already been thoroughly conquered, right? Who are they conquering now during this age of imperialism? Mostly Africa, but also India, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Basically anywhere that there are people of color. They're trying to take all of the non-white people countries and make them white people countries. And it's like a race, right? It's a competition between these countries to try to snatch up as much of this territory as possible to expand their empires as quickly as possible. It's like kids at a birthday party scurrying to a fallen piñata to try to get at the candy before someone else does. That's what these countries are doing, except with other countries. Anyway, this causes a lot of tension between the countries in Europe. Obviously, this sort of fierce competition going on, this land grabbing. And also, they weren't like conquering nicely, if there is such a thing. They were coercing and exploiting these territories. So there was just a lot of global dissatisfaction and resentment going on too, because people are behaving very badly. So during this age of imperialism, 1870 to 1914, we have this fierce rivalry between different countries trying to snatch up as much land as they can and really being like bullies about it, like a bunch of immature children, really. Everyone's sort of frenemies. And with frenemies, of course, come alliances. So there's all these different alliances forming. Countries promising to have each other's backs against other countries. So you have Russia and Serbia in an alliance, but Russia also has an alliance with France. And then France is in another alliance with Great Britain and Belgium. So all of that sort of melds into this alliance between Russia, France, and Great Britain called the Triple Entente. And then on the other hand, you have Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary. They have their own alliance. They're like middle school girls, all these various cliques forming. And then there's the Ottoman Empire, which, like, what the heck even was that, right? Because that's not a thing anymore. So the Ottoman Empire was basically Turkey, but it was bigger than Turkey. It was an Islamic empire that was founded in 1299. So this thing had been around for a while at this point. It included territory in southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. So you basically had to pass through the Ottoman Empire to travel from east to west, from Europe to Asia to trade at all. It was this bridge between the east and the west, which is a big deal. But by 1914, it was in major decline. And this was, this thing had been around for over 600 years. It had been a major world power, and it sort of fizzling out. There's like a bit of a power vacuum forming now. And this leads to the rise of Serbian nationalism. So Serbia had once been a part of the Ottoman Empire until it got its independence in 1878. And, with Dad obviously fizzling out, Serbia wants to rise up as its own sort of empire, if you will, and form this Yugoslav state. But in 1908, Austria-Hungary, which today are two different countries, but back then it was like sort of one thing, it was a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary annexed or took over Bosnia-Herzegovina. Serbia was not happy about that. Bosnia was Slavic. It was sort of in their realm. They wanted it in this Yugoslav thing they wanted to form. They didn't want Austria-Hungary to have it. 40% of the people living in Bosnia were Serbian. So because of all the imperialism, we have a tinderbox of tension and animosity between European countries. We also have all these alliances in response to that. Alliances on alliances on alliances. And starting in 1908, with the acquisition of Bosnia by Austria-Hungary, we have serious beef between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, plus like Bosnian Serbians. This is our pyre waiting for a spark. So let's talk about the spark. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was a Habsburg, which was a family, a very inbred family, a dynasty that ruled in Europe for 645 years. I will have an episode on the Habsburgs at some point. It has been on my list since the very beginning. Just haven't done it yet. But anyway, Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of the current emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph. Now, Franz Joseph, he had children. He had 4 children. So why is his nephew the heir to the throne? Well, 3 of those 4 children were girls, and in the Habsburg dynasty, even in the 1900s, females could not inherit the throne unless there was literally not one single male relative left living in the entire dynasty. So it was basically impossible for a female Habsburg to rule, because what were the chances that every single male relative would die? This is a massive family. Franz Joseph did have one son, Crown Prince Rudolf, who was in line to inherit the throne as the Crown Prince. But then he died in 1889 at the age of 30 in an apparent murder-suicide following a failed scandalous relationship. And I think I found the topic of my next mini-fix, because that story's super juicy. Look for that one on Patreon next week. Anyway, the prince is dead, right? Franz Joseph's younger brother would then inherit the throne next. Archduke Karl Ludwig was his name. He should be in line next. But then he died in 1896, and this leaves his son, Franz Joseph's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, in line for the throne. Franz, it feels weird to call him Franz, but Franz, he does something unusual for someone in his time and in his position, especially for a Habsburg. He marries for love, much to the displeasure of his uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph, because Franz Ferdinand marries a woman named Sophie Chotek, who I mean, she wasn't like a commoner or anything like that. She came from a family of Czech nobles, but she was not royalty. She didn't come from a reigning family, some great European dynasty, as was expected for Franz as the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The Habsburgs were serious about this whole royalty marries royalty thing. You don't become the most inbred family ever without taking that seriously. But Franz marries Sophie because he's deeply in love with her. Franz Joseph, the emperor, is not pleased. He actually refused to attend their wedding. And he's mostly upset about this because it means, in these weird rules that the Habsburgs have about inheriting the throne and whatnot, what it means, Sophie not being royalty, it means that their children cannot inherit the throne after Franz. And, that's inconvenient for a dynasty in its 627th year. But Franz is still the heir. His children just can't be. Jesse Greenspan writes for History.com, quote, Sophie also became the victim of countless petty slights. At imperial banquets, for example, she entered each room last, without an escort, and was then seated far away from her husband at the dinner table, end quote. Yeah, Habsburgs kind of sucked. As the heir to the throne and the inspector general of the army, Franz agreed to attend a series of military exercises in Bosnia in June of 1914. So as I mentioned before, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia not long before this, back in 1908. Franz had actually been against this move. He thought it was a bad idea to annex Bosnia because he knew that it would cause problems with Serbia. He knew how Serbia would feel about this, but whatever, they did it anyway. He's not emperor yet, doesn't really get to make those decisions, so they did it anyway, and now he's going there on this little, tour of sorts. And as Franz predicted, Serbia was not happy with Austria-Hungary. Not really Serbia, more like an extremist nationalist group within Serbia and Bosnia. Because remember, Bosnia is roughly 40% Serbian. And they're not happy with Austria-Hungary taking Bosnia. And when they find out that the heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, is coming to Bosnia, they're like, oh, heck no, right? This extremist nationalist group that I'm talking about specifically was called the Young Bosnians. So this was a group of Bosnian Serbs, so Serbs living in Bosnia, who were students. They were peasant students. I know this is a very specific group. And they decide to assassinate Franz Ferdinand during his visit to Bosnia. Now, that's a tall order for peasant students, right? They didn't do this without help. This group went to Belgrade, which is the capital city of Serbia, and they got help in the form of weapons, bombs, and guns, plus cyanide capsules, as well as training on how to use all of this from a terrorist group called the Black Hand. I know, Black Hand. What? Sound familiar? It should if you listen to episode 133 about the Axeman of New Orleans, because one theory there was that the murders were connected to an Italian mafia group called the Black Hand Society. This is a totally different Black Hand terrorist group, believe it or not. This one is a Serbian one operating in Bosnia. That was an Italian one, possibly operating in New Orleans. I don't know who janked the name from the other, or if it was a just total coincidence or what, but totally different entities. But the Serbian Black Hand that helped arm and train these Bosnian students and help them smuggle the weapons back over the border from Serbia to Bosnia, these guys had close ties to the Serbian army. So some suspect that the Serbian government was actually involved in this assassination attempt, but that's never been proven. And it's I think that's kind of unlikely. Why would the Serbian government choose peasant students to carry this out? Surely they have better options than that. As far as we know, it was this group of rogue Bosnian Serb peasant students, the Young Bosnians. So they get back into Bosnia, to Sarajevo, where Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are set to make their public appearance. And they bide their time, right? Meanwhile, Franz and Sophie set out for Bosnia on June 23rd. They had already received multiple warnings to cancel this trip because the tensions were so high and there was a strong possibility that they were going to encounter violence there, that they were going to be attacked. On the way, the axles on their car overheated, and Franz supposedly said, quote, "Our journey starts with an extremely promising omen. Here our car burns, and down there they will throw bombs at us." End quote. I don't know if that's actually a direct quote. It's a little too on the nose for me, but Franz was obviously aware that they were going into a bad situation and that they would potentially be in danger while in Bosnia. They go anyway. By the way, Franz was 50 years old. He's not like a young man. He's 50 at the time. Sophie was 46. They had 3 children, a daughter, Sophie, who was 13 at the time, and then 2 sons. Maximilian was 12 and Ernst was 10 at the time, but the children did not go with their parents to Bosnia, luckily. Anyway, they arrive at a town just outside of Sarajevo. Franz attends these military exercises for 2 days while Sophie visits schools and orphanages. Very wholesome. One of those nights, on sort of like on a whim, they decide to drive into Sarajevo to check out the bazaars. They're really pretty ballsy, these two, considering this sort of atmosphere that they're in here. But they're treated with kindness by the crowd of onlookers that gathers that night at the bazaars. And I don't know if this gave them sort of a false sense of security or what. Franz really didn't seem to care about the danger that he apparently knew he and his wife were in just being in Bosnia. So on the last day before they were set to go home, June 28th, they're supposed to do this sort of parade through Sarajevo in this motorcade to City Hall. Greenspan explains, writing, quote, "That morning, June 28th, the Archduke sent a telegram to his eldest son congratulating him on his latest exam results. He and Sophie then boarded a train for the short ride into Sarajevo. For once, Sophie was permitted to walk alongside Ferdinand during a brief troop inspection, after which the couple got in an open-topped car for a motorcade ride to City Hall. The car in front of them was supposed to carry 6 specially trained officers, but instead had only 1, plus 3 local policemen. In fact, throughout the trip, Austro-Hungarian officials allegedly focused more attention on dinner menus than security details." End quote. Which is really a pity, because 7 members of this young Bosnians terrorist peasant student assassins group are lying in wait amongst the gathering crowds. Greenspan goes on, quote, "When the motorcade passed by, its route having been published in advance," stupid, Chabrinovic, who was one of these 7 young Bosnian guys, asked which car carried the Archduke. He then hurled his bomb at the car, only to watch it bounce off the folded-up roof and roll underneath the wrong vehicle. The subsequent explosion wounded 2 army officers and several bystanders, but left Ferdinand and Sophie essentially unharmed. Chabrinovic jumped into the mostly dry riverbed and made a half-hearted attempt to kill himself, because remember he had those cyanide tablets, before being apprehended. "I'm a Serbian hero," he purportedly shouted as the police led him away. At least 2 other young Bosnians also had good looks at the Archduke, but apparently lost the nerve to attempt an assassination. End quote. So, you would think, close call, a crazy dude just hurled a bomb at the car and nearly missed. You might think Franz and Sophie's car would be hurried out of there at that point. Guards would assemble, form a human shield of some kind, whatever. Get them out of there. That is not what happened, though. Instead, Franz decided to continue this little parade. He's like, keep it going. We're good. They missed. We're good. And they keep going towards City Hall as if nothing even happened. Someone just threw a bomb at them. It's crazy to me. They keep going. They make it to this event at City Hall, do their thing there. And then Franz decides he wants to go visit some wounded officers in the hospital before they go. Dude is not bothered at all by almost getting bombed. He adds another stop to this trip. So they head for the hospital. And, they are moving pretty fast now. They sort of zip down the street trying to avoid any more assassination attempts. But they make a wrong turn. Yeah, they make a wrong turn. And they end up on a street sort of stalled out. They're trying to reverse back out of this street, right, to go back in the right direction. And as they're sort of stalled out, trying to reverse and to get turned around, they happen to be right in front of another young Bosnian dude, a guy, a teenager named Gavrilo Princip. Princip pulls out his gun and fires 2 shots toward the open-top car where Franz and Sophie are riding, very much on display. One bullet hits Franz in the neck. The second hits Sophie in the abdomen. They do not die immediately. Franz apparently uttered, quote, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Heartbreaking. But within minutes, they were both dead. Gavrilo Princip later confessed to being the gunman. He admitted, he was trying to kill Franz. He had not meant to kill Sophie. He was a 19-year-old Serbian army reject, 3 weeks too young to receive the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he died of tuberculosis 4 years in at the age of 23. Gavrilo Princip was, he was kind of a nobody, but he had taken down Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, out of this, sort of misplaced nationalist fervor, angry over Austria-Hungary taking Bosnia, which he believed belonged to Serbia. Never mind Franz Ferdinand had actually opposed that acquisition, whatever. What Princip most likely did not expect when he fired his pistol that day in Sarajevo was that the bullet he lodged in the Archduke's neck was also the spark, the tiny fluttering ember that would ignite the First World War. Austria-Hungary is furious, of course, with Serbia, even though Princip was technically Bosnian and not at all associated with the Serbian government. They go to their ally, Germany. Austria-Hungary and Germany, they team up against Serbia. And this is really the reason why Germany mostly gets blamed for World War I, because they offered Austria-Hungary this sort of unconditional endless support. It's often referred to as the blank check assurance. They were down to back Austria-Hungary no matter what, even when their actions didn't really make sense. According to Norwich University, quote, "This blank check via unconditional support sought military and political triumph in securing the Balkans for Germany. It also gave Austro-Hungarian leaders the confidence they needed to embark on war against Serbia. Today, historians regard it as one of the most controversial decisions in the history of modern warfare, particularly because Germany failed to withdraw the unconditional support when given the opportunity. It is also widely recognized as one of the main reasons Germany is seen as responsible for the escalation and continuation of World War I." End quote. Thanks a lot, Germany. Because Serbia wanted to negotiate. They wanted to figure this out. They wanted to solve this dispute between themselves and Austria-Hungary. They didn't even kill the guy, right? Austria-Hungary ain't having it though. And with Germany backing them, they declare war on Serbia on July 28th, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination. And at that point, the whole thing goes up in flames. Just gets completely out of control, as fires tend to do. Within a week, Russia, France, Belgium, Great Britain, and Montenegro had all joined the conflict. Why? What do they care about Franz Ferdinand? They don't. They don't care about Franz Ferdinand. They don't care about Austria-Hungary, but they have all these intertwining alliances already because of the imperialism, because of the tensions that had been brewing over the last 50 years, this age of imperialism, the competition. And when your ally or even your ally's ally goes to war, eventually you do too. More and more countries join the conflict like dominoes falling over one by one. So, I really wanted to tell this story because I think it's one of the most, not even misunderstood, just straight up not known, not understood, unknown, critical moments in history. How did we get here? What was World War I even about? And the reason no one really knows the answer to that is because there isn't a good answer. It was kind of about nothing. The only concrete thing we can trace it to is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand within the context of a world that was already poised to erupt into flames. So the real question is, was that preventable? That's all that really matters going forward, right? We can't change the past. That happened. How do we keep it from happening again? Here's the thing. It wasn't Serbia that assassinated Franz Ferdinand. I mean, the Black Hand that did possibly have some ties to the Serbian army, but, for the most part, it wasn't Serbia. It was a group of peasant students, just some teenagers. And Austro-Hungary, they should have never declared war on Serbia over this assassination. But they had Germany's support. They had Germany backing them, these alliances, so why not? And in the end, the regrettable actions of some misguided punk kid resulted in the deaths of some 30 million people. Now, this is a lesson I think we can apply today. We have had some really incendiary assassinations and assassination attempts of late. And rather than learn from this mistake with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the start of World War I, we seem to be leaning right into it and almost trying to make the same mistake now that we did then. Not to get political, I know you guys hate that. I hate that too, to be honest, but I can't not point this out. We saw this with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We saw people try to take it there. Conclusions were made almost immediately as to the identity of the person or the entity who had assassinated Kirk. And that's not who that person was at all. It was just some random guy, some punk kid. Once again, another Gavrilo Princip. Not a political group. Not the left, not the liberals, not the right, not the conservatives. It wasn't us. It wasn't any of us. It was just some guy. But you can see how this sort of thing goes up in flames very quickly when people jump to conclusions instead of thinking rationally, when martyrs are made and stones are cast. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was an unfortunate tragedy. But it should never have ignited all of Europe. It should never have spiraled out of control until it pitted everyone against everyone else. And that happened, really, because of the environment in which that spark landed. That perfect pyre, that tinderbox. So really, I think there's two important lessons to be learned from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the start of World War I. Number one, don't create an environment, a world in which fire can ignite this easily. Don't behave like young children fighting over toys or piñata candy or middle school girls forming cliques and casting out frenemies. And number two, don't jump to conclusions. Don't twist a random act of violence into something worth rallying behind, something worth laying down your life for, handing over your sons for. 30 million dead. And for what? For what? These are critically important historical mistakes to learn from because, as we know, despite President Woodrow Wilson's then claim that World War I was the, quote, war to end all wars, that wasn't true. It wasn't. There was a World War II. And we certainly don't want a World War III. Because if World War I irrevocably changed the world just with its trenches and airplanes, imagine the potential devastation of a World War III with the technology that we have today. I'll leave you with the words of Albert Einstein, who said in 1949, quote, "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones," end quote. These horrors are preventable, but only if we know enough about the past to identify the next spark and swiftly snuff it out. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.